Abuse in later life is a term that we came up with many years ago, back in the 1990s in Wisconsin, when we started to work at the intersection of elder abuse, domestic violence, and sexual assault. So we wanted to focus on cases that were broader than intimate partner violence, recognizing that adult children, family members, and caregivers were abusers. We also knew that it was not our expertise to focus on self-neglect, and that's part of a definition of elder abuse in many states. And we recognized that the Aging Services Network focuses on a population 60 plus, but there was a gap in services in domestic violence and sexual assault programs all the way down to the age of 50. So we coined this phrase, abuse in later life, that has four major components. And the first is we took a look at what do we mean by older. And by talking to survivors throughout the state of Wisconsin, what we recognized is those victims from age 50 to 62 had some significant barriers that were different and unique from older victims and younger victims. Most of those victims no longer had dependent children, therefore were not eligible for TANF or welfare type programs that are available to moms and kids. On the other end, they were too young to be eligible for services through the Older Americans Act or Social Security. So we wanted to be sure to address that population and not lose that group that was not able to receive services from a number of other folks. And we recognized when we talked to some of our marginalized communities that the life expectancy in those communities might be younger than for the mainstream population. And if we had our age up to 60 or 65, we might lose an opportunity to work in those communities as well. Now, I want to recognize that with age, the other piece of it is we want to focus on that 50 to 62, but not exclusively. Of course, there are folks in their 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond that can benefit from domestic violence and sexual assault programs. And there are cultural and generational differences that move throughout life. And so we really want to encourage domestic violence and sexual assault programs to think about what their programming might need to change or enhance to work with folks in their 70s, 80s, and beyond. We know that folks 80 and older may have more medical issues, may have more vulnerabilities. Research indicates that about half of people over 80 have some form of dementia. And so we're going to need to think about how to tailor our services in a new way to really meet that old, if you will. The oldest case I know of sexual assault is a woman who is 104 years old who was sexually assaulted living in a facility by her son-in-law. Her daughter was also living in that facility and was a victim of domestic violence. So when we think about that case, how are we as domestic violence and sexual assault advocates prepared to provide and offer services and support in a case like that?
We've talked about age. Are there any other components to the definition that you would list?
So abuse in later life, as we talked about earlier, involves looking at what is later life. But there were three other components that we included in our definition at NCALL about when we defined abuse in later life. The second piece was the relationship between the victim and the abuser. So typically in domestic violence, we focus on intimate partner violence, and that's a huge and significant issue in elder abuse. And it's part of why we do this work at the intersection of elder abuse and domestic violence. Significant portion of elder abuse is in fact intimate partner violence, but not all of it. As we talked to men and women who were being abused in later life, we heard stories from folks being abused by their adult children, by family members, and by caregivers. And what they described had some unique aspects to it, but at the heart of it was often power and control, and what they were looking for were the things that domestic violence and sexual assault programs can provide: safety planning, legal advocacy, support groups, crisis lines, emergency shelter, and there were no other places in communities for these older victims to go, if not a domestic violence or a sexual assault program. So we expanded the definition under abuse in later life to be broader than intimate partner violence. Then the third piece is that we looked at the forms of abuse, and we include physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional, psychological abuse, financial exploitation, and neglect. So for domestic violence and sexual assault advocates, financial exploitation and neglect might be new forms that they are not as familiar working with, but are common scenarios that we're going to see in later life. And finally, the setting where the abuse can occur is important. So most older adults are living in the community in their private dwellings, but some are living in assisted living, in nursing homes, in other kinds of facilities. And we wanted to include those cases because there often are not resources for dealing with domestic violence or sexual assault for people living in facilities. And to recognize that some of this sadly happens in public as well, that unfortunately stalking in later life occurs, and that we wanted to be aware of that issue and able to address that as well.